Start. Good evening. My name is Rachel Glazer, co-chair of the Baltimore Jewish Council's Holocaust Remembrance Commission. We welcome you this evening to the 2021 Kristallnacht commemoration. We are grateful to the David and Regina Weinberg Foundation, a supporting foundation of the Associated, and the Associated Jewish Community Federation of Baltimore for their support of this evening's program.
My name is Bob Lowy, also co-chair of the Holocaust Remembrance Commission. We are pleased to invite Rabbi Andrew Bush of Baltimore Hebrew Congregation and president of the Baltimore Jewish Council for his opening remarks. Rabbi Bush.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, all of you who have taken time out of your night for this important gathering, this gathering of remembrance, this gathering of commitment, this year specifically looking closely at our own history and understanding its potential connections to other histories, even as they differ in details, their overlap as we think of them. The Hungarian Jewish poet, Miklos Radnotny, wrote the following in a poem entitled Clouded Sky. Sometimes a year looks back and howls, then drops to its knees. Autumn is too much for me. It waits again and the winter waits with its dull pain. Radnotny wrote this a couple of years after the Holocaust, after Kristallnacht, and this poet died actually during the Shoah. As we remember back specifically this evening to events that are tied to 1938, but speak more broadly as well, and also to events that tie back to the 1920s, but are more broad as well. We think of how in remembrance is the seed of redemption, or as the poet says, sometimes a year looks back and howls, then drops to its knees. Let us pay attention today, not only to the information we hear from our esteemed scholar, but also to our hearts as we understand the pain of a given year, of more than one given year, and honor the memories of those who suffered. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Bush. Tonight, we gather in this virtual space to remember the night of broken glass, the November pogrom. November 9th and 10th, 1938, saw for the first time widespread eruption of planned anti-Jewish violence in Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland. Over 1,000 synagogues were burned, 7,000 Jewish businesses were demolished, and 30,000 Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps. 236 were killed. After Kristallnacht, Jews living in Germany, in Austria, and in truth, throughout Europe could no longer pretend that life for them would ever return to normal. The November pogrom revealed the true horrors of the Nazi regime, that a citizenry could be robbed of its rights and the legal machinery of a government could implement calculated, systematic violence with impunity. The shattering of glass shattered innocence. It shattered the sacred houses of worship. It shattered the homes of all European Jews, and it shattered their lives. It drew an unswerving line from the fires of the burning synagogues on Kristallnacht to subsequent fires of the crematoria. The riots, violence, profanation, destruction, and death that marked Kristallnacht throughout Nazi Germany in 1938 marked the beginning of the end for European Jewry at that time.
We light candles in remembrance of all that was lost during those dark times. But a candle also brings light into the darkness, shining a path toward renewal and hope. We light this candle in remembrance of those who lost their lives during the Shoah and in the hope that the world will never allow a repetition of such hatred and violence again. We also remember Edith Cord, who passed away this September at the age of 93. Edith was a Holocaust survivor and a dedicated member of our Speakers Bureau. She dedicated much of her time to speak to audiences, especially the youth, and to inspire them with her life story. During our spring Yom HaShoah commemoration, we will be honoring her legacy. This year, we light a second candle in remembrance of all victims of discriminatory violence and persecution for their religion, race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation. In light of the subject for tonight's program, we specifically remember and honor those African-American citizens murdered as a result of the widespread violence that erupted during this country's Tulsa Race Massacre from May 31 to June 1, 1921. Within these 24 hours, 35 city blocks were burned, including churches, schools, businesses, a hospital, and a library. An estimated 100 to 300 individuals were killed, and over 800 were injured, while government officials did little to stem the violence. Tonight, we honor the memories of those who were murdered in this horrific event and hope to bring light to their history of degradation and persecution, less than 20 years before the Holocaust.
Tonight, November 9th, marks the 83rd anniversary of Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. This year also marks the 100th anniversary of one of the deadliest events in American history, the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. Over this past year, we have seen alarmingly high rates of both anti-Semitism and racism all over the world, especially within the United States. Many of us who viewed the programs and documentaries about Tulsa this past summer were shocked at the images we saw, so strikingly similar to the images we have seen of Kristallnacht. Tonight, we are honored to welcome Dr. Joshua Shanes, Associate Professor of Jewish Studies at the College of Charleston, to explore the history of pogroms and draw the connection between Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, and the Tulsa Race Massacre. Dr. Joshua Shanes is Associate Professor of Jewish Studies and Director of the Center for Israel Studies at the College of Charleston. He has published widely on modern Jewish politics, culture, and religion, as well as anti-Semitism and contemporary American politics in academic and popular venues, including the Washington Post, Slate, Haaretz, and many others. At the end of the presentation, we have a brief question and answer session with Dr. Shanes. If you have a question for our guest, please submit them via the question and answer Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Shanes.
Thank you so much for inviting me and being part of that very moving opening to this solemn day. I speak to you all from Charleston, South Carolina, just a few blocks from that terrible day in 2015 at the massacre at the AME Church some 6 years ago, but also right next to that from the Center Park of Charleston, where there is a Holocaust memorial, a very moving one, that was built some 20 years ago and used to have, until just a year ago, a massive statue of the defender of slavery, John C. Calhoun, that I often pointed out to my students, literally cast a shadow over the Holocaust memorial. And I thought a lot about that. Every year I was teaching the Holocaust and teaching Jewish history and Charleston history, because that blending of a statue, which was finally just removed 1 year ago, with the Holocaust memorial, tells us a lot about the way Jews and Americans think about these events. Today's November 9th, which is actually a very big day in German history. Kristallnacht, which I'll add a little bit more about in a moment, happened on November 9th. So did the failed revolution, the putsch of Hitler in 1925. So did the declaration of the Weimar government itself. The doomed Weimar government itself was on November 9th. And so too did the Berlin Wall. For those of you, at least my age or older, remember this quite well. The Berlin Wall come down, and so dominant is the mood of November 9th with Kristallnacht and its connection with the Holocaust, that when Germany was reunified, Germany, it's hard to imagine, for those of you who were alive and remember it well, it's hard to imagine a more moving day to celebrate, for Germans to celebrate the reunification of the country than November 9th. But that was the last day they would ever have chosen to celebrate that day, because it's so connected with Kristallnacht and with the Holocaust and with a past that Germany doesn't seek to forget. They're quite good about that, actually, but that they seek to not celebrate in any way, certainly not with statues or high school names or street names. There is no Hitler High, and there is no Eichmann Boulevard in Germany today. Kristallnacht broke out on November 9th as a result of an assassination that happened in Paris. A Jewish, young Jewish man, parents were among thousands that had been deported to Poland and left in no man's land, where, by the way, thousands would ultimately die before the war even broke out. And he assassinated a minor official in France. And as a result of that, the Nazi Party orchestrated a massive series of pogroms, which I'll define for you in a moment. And it wasn't just one pogrom in a sense, it was hundreds of them across all of Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland. And you had the numbers that were read to us a moment ago. It was horrific, and it was scary, and it was a defining line. And in many ways, it's the turning point. It's the end of one era, the end of the era of a sort of apartheid regime that Nazi Germany had established in Germany, and the beginning move towards escalation. The first time that Jews were arrested as Jews and sent to concentration camps. About 30,000 young Jewish men were sent to concentration camps. And soon thereafter, the Holocaust would proceed. In 1939, with the beginning of World War II, the occupation of Western Poland and the ghettos, and then in 1941, with the decision to begin the final solution itself. When the pogroms happened, a pogrom is a Russian word, which I'll explain in a moment, but essentially it means a kind of outbreak of mass violence directed against a minority. It could be a religious or an ethnic or a racial minority. And it will always have at least the passivity of the authorities. In this case, it wasn't just the passivity. In this case, it was the government itself. There are some scholars who don't like to use the word pogrom because it was so orchestrated, but I think it does capture something of the day, that you have hundreds of these mass attacks against a minority. There were about 100 Jews who were murdered on top of that. And I want to point out a couple of aspects of the pogroms in Kristallnacht and earlier. You have instigation by the state, by the press. You have the authorities who stand by. You have the lack of accountability in terms of economic accountability. The insurance companies, there were still insurance companies in Nazi Germany in 1938 that were required to pay out policies, but the Nazi state appropriated that money with a massive $1 billion Reichsmark fine on the Jewish community, which was itself blamed for the violence inflicted upon them. And that money was appropriated from them. And this begins the slide into the Third Reich, into the final solution, excuse me. I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about what a pogrom is over the previous 60 or 70 years, how it escalated, and then think about, for a few minutes in the time that we have, how this applies back to our case in America, and come back maybe for a moment at the end to that Charleston scene with those two memorials, those two monuments sitting just a few blocks away from me. The first pogroms, the word became internationalized in 1881. At that point in time in Russia, there was a lot of political instability. There was a lot of anti-Semitism. Modern anti-Semitism was escalating, not decreasing, during the 1870s and 1880s. And a massive waves of pogroms broke out in mostly in southern Ukraine against Jews. Mass mob attacks stoked by the press, where people assumed that the government was behind them, or at least what supported them. Because in a world of censorship, one assumes if these things are in the paper, it must be okay. And so you have massive wave of maybe 240 attacks from one town to the next across 1881 and 82. So impressive were these attacks that they're discussed across the Western world. You have shock and protests by Western governments and Western populations. And what people are, and you have the birth also, I would say, of Zionism and of Jewish socialism and of mass migration of Jews to the West, to Western Europe and to America. And what's fascinating about those pogroms is that in total, across the entire series of 240 pogroms, we think there were maybe 40 or 50 Jews murdered in total. That's a shocking number to many people. People assume there must have been thousands or tens of thousands or much more, considering the impact that it had. But it just goes to show you the kind of world that Jews lived in until that time. There was an assumption of safety that most people had. And the idea of mass material violence, that even a few dozen people could be murdered during these 2 or 3 or 4 years, was shocking to people. It was absolutely shocking to people. But what was actually most destructive following those pogroms were the so-called May laws. The May laws were the legislative response of the Tsar of Russia, who, like in Kristallnacht, and as we'll see also in America, blamed the victims for the violence inflicted upon them. The assumption was Jews deserve this, they're the ones who instigated this, and therefore they are to blame. And a whole series of new laws restricting Jewish economic opportunities, where they could live, what they could do, etc., made their lives a true living hell. And it was really in many ways that economic, what one historian called cold pogroms, that economic legislative pressure that was probably more effective in pushing Jews to move to America than even the violence itself. And this is a parallel we'll see again and again. As we go into the 20th century, the violence of the pogroms increased, but the basic model stays the same. Popular instigation by the press. You have a government that either supports them or is looking the other way and doesn't mind it so much. But you have escalating numbers, so that 1903, 1905, you start seeing hundreds and soon thousands of Jews being killed in a wave of pogroms. During and after World War I in Ukraine, there may have been as many as 200,000 Jews murdered across East Central Europe during the revolutions and wars that followed World War I, and of course during the war itself. Incidentally, there's a new book that has just been released called In the Midst of Civilized Europe by Jeff Weidlinger, which is a celebrated book, long awaited, that will detail exactly what happened during those pogroms and how they connect to the true annihilation that was to come 20 years later during the Holocaust. Now, if we think about this history and then try to apply it to our own case, I think we can see a lot of parallels, and I think it's important to do so. It seems to me, I was raised on a slogan of never again. That's a phrase many of you have heard, but never again has two different possible meanings. Never again could have a meaning of never again will we allow this to happen to ourselves. Therefore, we will never again care what anyone thinks about us, but we are going to do whatever it takes to defend ourselves, even if it means actions which we consider immoral or whatnot. But never again could have a much better meaning, a much more powerful meaning, and certainly the one that I was raised on going through my Jewish education as a child. Never again means never again to anyone. Never again means understanding that the atrocities that began in Russia in the 1880s and escalated through World War I into the Nazi era. Never again means when you begin to see these injustices in this system, you speak up at that point, that you don't wait until it gets to the abyss of Auschwitz, but you speak up much sooner. And it seems to me that this is the lesson that we need to apply thinking about America. Now, I study Jewish history quite a lot, modern Jewish history. And one of my questions I ask my students when we study American Jewish history, I ask them, is America just another country? Is America somehow fundamentally similar or different from those in Western Europe? You have Jews, they get emancipated in America, they're emancipated in Europe. Is this fundamentally similar? And the answer the students give is quite a wide range, but one of the fundamental things they need to describe to me is that there is anti-Semitism in America, and it wanes and waxes. And of course, right now we're in a more heightened period of time. But overwhelmingly in America, Jews do not suffer from pogroms in America. Jews do not suffer, for the most part, with few exceptions in certain times and places, the kind of massive systemic othering that happens to them certainly in Eastern Europe and later under the Nazi regime. Because the key demarcation in America of otherness and of Americanness has been from day one racial. And overwhelmingly, although Jews are at times racialized or choose to racialize themselves, to imagine themselves or be imagined as some sort of unique race, overwhelmingly in American history, Jews became white in all the ways that counted. The othering based on skin, that othering was critical to Jewish success in America, starting here where I'm sitting right now in Charleston, South Carolina, where they were welcomed with freedoms that even Catholics, by the way, didn't have. But that was in Charleston, the leading port of slave importation in the colonies and in the country thereafter. So what I want to think about is, how do we take this model? How do we understand a systemic, a society with systemic discrimination against an othered minority that suffers periodic violent abuse to keep them in their place? Now, what happened in Tulsa, the words that were used in the introduction today was race riot. That's actually was race massacre, but that's actually an improvement over the old race riot, which suggests some sort of equal battle of gangs, some sort of violent West Side story. But that's not the reality, quite clearly. What happens in Tulsa, and it happens elsewhere as well, in Wilmington, North Carolina, and many other places, not to mention the 5,000 or so individual African Americans who were lynched during these decades, and the countless others who feared that violence. What you have here is a very parallel system. You have an othered minority, legislatively and by social convention, greatly limited in what they could accomplish, greatly limited where they could live and what they could do, and countless other ways. And yet, when they climb out of those disabilities in places, when they show any sort of effort at human growth, at daring to think about human equality, we see this outbreak of mob violence in so many similar ways. We see the press stoking the hatred. We see the authorities either outright organizing and supporting these events, and Tulsa was truly terrible, and as were many others, or simply standing by and allowing it to happen, and often, as it happened to Jews in Europe, often persecuting and prosecuting the victims themselves for attempting to defend themselves. We see a result afterwards of the society blaming the victims for what happened. The reason why it may have been called a race riot as opposed to a race massacre is it allowed the insurance companies not to pay out on policies. These were middle-class people. They had insurance, and the insurance companies refused to pay them out. They had no choice but to simply leave. And I have to say, I was raised, as were many of you listening right now, to understand the history of the Holocaust quite profoundly, to know that it happened, to know why it happened, to understand how it happened, and to commemorate the loss of lives and civilization and culture and buildings and archives and artifacts, all of that. And yet, nevertheless, as I grew up, and I have to tell you, I'm an historian. I was not a math and science guy. I was a history person. So I took AP US history and AP European history, and I went to college and I majored in history, in modern history, American and European. And I went to graduate school, and I have a PhD from what's considered a very competitive school. And yet I was literally in my 30s, before I learned of what happened in Tulsa. I think, to my mind, many Americans did not realize that Tulsa even existed until it was portrayed dramatically in the Watchmen series a few years ago on HBO, which, by the way, I recommend to everyone. It's a very powerful moment in the opening scene of the first episode. And even then, I spoke to friends with African-American children, by the way, who did not know this happened, who were not clear whether or not this was something that was fictional, because the Watchmen series is a alternate reality series, or this something that actually happened. So it seems to me that what we need to think about is the way that a pogrom, an organized act of mass violence, how that is a phenomenon broader than Jewish history. And for Jews to understand that this is something that speaks to us collectively, that this is something that we can see happening and need to address, as, by the way, some Jews always have. I'm not going to give an alternate history and assume that Jews were always overwhelmingly for advocating civil rights and advocating integration. That's not true. Jews are, and generally speaking, like the society around them. Jews in the South, for the most part, supported slavery before the Civil War, supported Jim Crow during that era, and for the most part, were not advocating for integration. I wouldn't expect them to be better or worse than other people, but to a certain extent, outstanding people did stand up, including during the Tulsa Massacre. So in this sense, anti-Semitism and racism are very much connected, but in a way that puts the Jews in the place, I wouldn't say of, it's not about oppressor, God forbid. It's more of a sense of Jews are in the place of the mainstream society. And Jews knew this and know this. There's a reason why outstanding Jews were very engaged in the civil rights struggle from the very beginning, co-founding the NAACP and so on. But I want to connect them in another way, because there is a sense, I think, there is a sense of frustration that many people feel between anti-Semitism and racism, a sense of a lost alliance in the 1960s, a sense that Jews and African Americans lost the chance to work together. And modern scholarship points the way that this isn't so, that actually in the 1960s, as the civil rights movement got going, as people started to learn about these things, as African Americans switched from a mode that was dominated by a notion of broad coalition to an idea of Black power, that Jews celebrated that transformation, and absorbed it for themselves, and took inspiration for themselves, and took ideas about Jewish pride, and even Zionism itself, even as anti-Zionism grew as a movement. Jews let that go and took inspiration for their own pride and that alliance. It goes both ways in a way that I think is a very positive way to look forward that we don't hear nearly enough. So we have a model here of anti-Semitism that begins in Russia, it begins in Central Europe and moves to Russia in the 1870s and 1880s, of mass violence against a subaltern group that grows in the 20th century, that evolves into the Holocaust in a way that is today widely commemorated, and rightly so. And we can take that same model and move it to America and think about how that model applies here, how we see a subaltern group that is not commemorated, but needs to be, and how we see acts of widespread violence and a social structure that blames the victims for their own persecution, that hides from them the ability to overcome it for decade after decade. And in this way, it seems to me, the motto with which we all grew up of never again looks forward, looks to the past, but to the future, and sees this as a universal phenomenon that we all can address. What happened in Europe, in a sense, is being commemorated. But I have to tell you, one of the most powerful monuments to the terror of the Nazi period, which we think about every year on this date, is a museum in Berlin called the Topography of Terror. And it's a museum that studies what's called the security division of the Nazi state, but it wasn't really about security. It was the apparatus of the SS, which took control of Jewish policy after Kristallnacht. It was the apparatus of the Gestapo. It was the apparatus of terror, and explains how that worked. And I think about that name very often, a topography of terror, because that was the design of the monuments that I discussed just down the block from where I stood, just next door to the AME church from the 2015 massacre. It was a topography that was designed to remind African Americans of their place and of their inability to push back against that, to know who they were and their subordinate place. It's very hard for me to imagine, as I began talking tonight, living in Germany today and imagining a landscape that celebrates in any way the terrible regime of the Nazi period. Certainly there are museums. Certainly the artifacts of that period, the story that's told, are widely available. Every school child goes to the museums, learns the stories, understands how the state itself has to grapple with what it means to be a German today, knowing that this is part of German history. It's not an exceptional part. It's part of what makes a German. There's many other things as well, but that's part of the story that they have to address, and they do address, and they think about it quite a bit. I think that's one of the reasons why Germany today is such a vibrant democracy. It's one of the reasons why there's a sense in Germany of the special obligations to Israel and to Jews more broadly, to Russian Jews 20, 30 years ago, to Israel, and to world Jewry more broadly. And this is something that I think we in America can think about quite a bit. When we think about events like Tulsa, when we think about the decades of lynchings, when we think about Jim Crow, when we think about the system of centuries of othering a group from slavery to Jim Crow and beyond, it's not a dissimilar situation. And it's not to say one is better or worse, God forbid. It's not to make that kind of comparison. It's to understand the relationship. And having spent the better part of 30 years studying the Holocaust, I can tell you that bringing it home to my students, explaining the Holocaust in terms that make sense to them, makes their understanding of what happened to the Jews that much more powerful, and makes their call to citizenship, their call to tikkun olam, making the world a better place. It brings it home in a much more powerful way that is far more real and far more effective. I'm very cognizant of the time. I'm aware that we have to stop after an hour, and I'd like to leave times for question and answers. So I'd like to stop here and invite the audience to please ask me what you will, and I will answer it to the best of my ability. Thank you again for coming, and thank you for the introductions.
Thank you, Dr. Shanes, for that eye-opening and powerful presentation. We now have a brief question and answer session. If you have a question for our guest, please submit them via the question and answer function, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I've got one from someone, so thank you for asking it so quickly. We didn't expect you to stop so quickly. So what did America do right to avoid the pogroms that happened in other democratic societies?
That's a great question. Thanks for asking it. And I would answer it in a couple ways. First of all, well, actually, I'm going to answer it in one way. I think you have to ask yourself the question, against whom? Against whom? You know, they asked once the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the one who passed away, the last Lubavitcher Rebbe passed away 30 years ago, they asked him, could a Holocaust ever happen in America? And he answered without blinking an eye, tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning. He was very despondent of human nature, and he was always aware of the possibility of the descent of mankind into that kind of abyss. And I don't know if I'm as despondent as he, but I would say that we didn't avoid pogroms. And I think that's part of the point. We didn't avoid pogroms, but the other that experienced those pogroms was not Jews. Certainly, we know there's been anti-Semitism. Of course, in our own era, we live in the world of having a Pittsburgh, of having a Tree of Life synagogue, and we have to address that. But we live in a country in which Jews were not that kind of other. They did not fear or feel any kind of wrath like they felt in Eastern Europe, which is why they came here. But we had pogroms. Tulsa was a pogrom in nearly every way that we can imagine. You have an other minority facing systemic discrimination, fearing violence with no recourse to address it. You have instigation by the press. You have a state that either it supports the violence or stands by while it happens. You have the violence that takes place itself. More African Americans were killed in Tulsa alone in 24 hours, by tenfold, than in all of the years of pogroms in Russia from 1881 to 1884. And so I think what we have to understand is that these things are not unique to Europe per se, but the object of hatred is different. And I think that's sort of the point of the event to a certain extent.
By the way, that question was asked by Russell Hendel.
Somebody I know. Nice to hear.
Yep, yep.
Dr. Shanes, we have another question from, I hope I'm saying the name right, Kael Sagir, who says, I would like to hear more about what you said regarding the 1960s and the lost opportunity versus embodying group pride.
That's a great question. I didn't want to dwell on it too much because of the night that we're in, but I think it is an important point because the lessons of that night is important to me as the history itself. So there was a common narrative, and there's a reason for it, that in the 1960s, the alliance, as it's been understood, between some Jews and African Americans towards civil rights seemed severed because the civil rights movement turned to a direction of what they call Black power, that didn't seek an alliance with whites, including with Jews. And the notion was, and particularly after 1967, when the movement turned toward a direction of anti-Zionism, there was a sense of, oh, this lost opportunity, we can't work together anymore. But what the scholarship of, especially I'm thinking of the scholarship of Mark Dallinger, but others as well, indicates to us is the Jews actually at the time celebrated that. They actually celebrated the Nation of Islam. It's hard to imagine that today with Louis Farrakhan and the right fear of his anti-Semitism, but they didn't fear it. They sensed that there was a corrective to systemic discrimination. They celebrated that African Americans were stepping up and aggressively asking that it be addressed. And they took the inspiration to celebrate Jewish pride as well, multiculturalism, Zionism. This is the reason many scholars think, why does Reform Judaism turn in the direction of reclaiming Jewish traditions? Not in an Orthodox way, of course, in their own way, but Hebrew language and rituals and so on was part of that era of multiculturalism, why Orthodoxy was able to thrive, why in many ways certain aspects of conservative Judaism, the day school movement was able to thrive, why Zionism was able to thrive. A lot of it was inspired by the Black example, and openly so. Leaders of the American Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Committee, and other major organizations spoke about this quite openly. And that to me is a sign of sort of togetherness that I think allows us to look not only past to tragedy, but forward to opportunities that's worth keeping in mind. So that's what I was speaking about. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in that history, to look into the work of Mark Dallinger. In fact, if I may take the liberty to do so, I'll type his name into the chat box, and anyone who's interested can look him up and look up his work. And I would encourage that very much.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So here's a softball for you. How can we get American Jews to see the connection to racism, white supremacy, that is the essence of our societal template? Can Jews acknowledge the othering of African Americans as similar to our experience of anti-Semitism?
Softball question, huh? Well, I'll answer that a couple ways. First of all, I'll tell you this. If any of you have never visited or brought people to visit the Museum of African American History, the Smithsonian Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C., I urge you at your earliest opportunity to do so. It's built across the road from the Holocaust Museum. You can do them both during the same visit. And that experience alone, especially if you do both those visits, gives you a sense precisely the phenomenon that you just described, Bob, that parallelism in a very, very powerful way. If I had my wish, if I won the lottery, $300 million or whatever, I would give every penny or most of it to support an initiative to bring every American to the Museum of African American History. I think that would have a better effect than almost anything I can imagine. It certainly changed me. So that's one thing to think about on a small scale. Obviously, I haven't won the lottery, so I can't do that, but I would encourage it very much. I don't think we need to imagine, I think Jews, I don't know if they have a special obligation. I don't, the fact that Jews collectively suffered the Holocaust, I'm not sure that means we have an obligation, but certainly we have a special opportunity thinking about our own past to connect in ways that we can use to overcome the kind of complacency that many of us, myself certainly, was raised on. To understand the nature of the Black experience. It's hard for us, I described in an article once for Tikkun magazine, a kind of parallel world of the Man in the High Castle. Man in the High Castle is a TV show that imagines the Nazis take over in America, or a dystopian alternate reality. But in many ways, that's been the reality in America for 400 years. And I think trying to understand that, it's not a question of guilt or guilting anyone. I know as Jews, we're always tempted to go that route, but it's not a question of guilting. It's a question of understanding the privilege that Jews, when I say Jews, white Jews, I mean white Jews. There are many Jews of color who are not white, but I mean Jews who have benefited from, for example, in my own family's case, my grandparents were able to buy a house and start building wealth towards middle-class status in a way that African Americans in Chicago could not. Their districts were redlined. There was nowhere they could go to acquire, to buy a home. And that has generational impact on my ability to become a professor today and speak to you all. I think understanding that impact, it's not a question of being responsible. It's understanding of appreciating the privilege that comes with that, and understanding how, since we have our own history as Jews in Europe and still struggle with anti-Semitism today in America, there's no question about that, especially in the last 5 to 10 years. I think we can understand a special opportunity we have to step up to the plate and speak to the systemic problems that your questioner asked about. So I think thinking about our own privilege, even as Jews, even as anti-Semitism rise, not as a sense of guilt, but as a sense of opportunity, I think is for me the way to go. And certainly with my students, that's how I talk to them as well, to think of the opportunities they have going out into the world, to be citizens that they can change things in that way.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Martha Wyman is asking, do you feel that the majority of young Jews are cognizant of the changes and precipitous rise of anti-Semitism and have the tools to address it?
That is a great question. I do think that Jewish community today is very good about talking about the rise of anti-Semitism. Do they have the tools to describe it? That is a tough question. Some of them do, for sure. But what I'd like to see, again, if I could wave a magic wand, I would like Jews to understand the nature of anti-Semitism, what are its key myths, and what are not its key myths. I would like them to understand where the threat lies, whether it's on the right or the left, as is the common cliche, to understand where the threat lies. Anti-Semitism is a modern ideology, grounded, of course, in hundreds of years of theological Jew hatred, Jews as Christ killers and things like this. But there's a basic notion of international Jewish power and conspiracy to undermine the fabric of society for nefarious purpose. They need to be able to identify that basic mythology. They need to see whether it is George Soros, whether it is Israel, whether it is any bogeyman that is being ascribed supernatural power to dominate the entire globe. When they see language like that, they need to be able to recognize it. And at the same time, they need to recognize similar sorts of xenophobia and demonization against any group and see the parallel between them. And if they can do that, I have faith in their ability to navigate the world. But they need to understand that mythology and avoid, I would say, it's sort of politicization. Politicization is the danger to my mind. in any direction whatsoever. I don't want to see Jews instrumentalized. I don't want to see anti-Semitism instrumentalized. And that would be my concern. I would urge those in charge of the Jewish community funds to do the events like you're doing tonight, and educate people as much as possible, rather than using anti-Semitism for fundraising or to advocate for a political party or something along those lines. So I can't say, I haven't done a survey of all American Jewish youth, but if anyone has power to educate in a direction, that seems to me the key. To understand the key modern myths of anti-Semitism. What is the mythology? How does it manifest? And how does it manifest beyond Jews? Anti-Semitism is, and Deborah Lipstadt, many of you know who she is, the celebrated scholar of the Holocaust, and is about to become confirmed as the ambassador to address anti-Semitism. It's an ambassadorial position. And she's spoken quite powerfully about the relationship between anti-Semitism and sort of neo-Nazism, right-wing, white nationalism. She's written about it quite, my professor, yes, she's a wonderful professor. So talking about the relationship between anti-Semitism and white nationalism. This week, right now, many of you know, is the trial in Charlottesville for the neo-Nazis who are white nationalists advocating the white supremacy and chanting, as many of you know, Jews will not replace us. Because part of the theology or ideology of white nationalism is that Jews are an international cabal orchestrating the miscegenation or the deracination of America against its whiteness, and therefore they're a threat. That is what the murderer, whose name I won't speak, in Pittsburgh, he's targeted that synagogue because they were supporters of HIAS, of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, that was trying to help immigrants, that was trying to combat xenophobia. That's why he targeted them. So I think understanding that relationship, as Deborah has tried to do, is absolutely vital. Educating people about what it is and what it isn't is absolutely vital.
Here's an interesting question. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's architecture captures the systematic and industrial nature of the Holocaust's planning and execution. In what ways has American racism embodied that same industrial nature?
It's a great question. I would say, first of all, we shouldn't make direct comparisons. There has never been an Auschwitz in American soil. We've had concentration camps. You know this, of course, with the internment of the Japanese, and of course, the internment of African Americans during slavery and during Jim Crow. But we have never created industrialized mass death. That is a unique feature of the Holocaust that has not been reproduced by America, nor should we pretend that it has. But at the same time, I think we can try to think about the way that racism has worked and continues to work systemically in America in its own American context. Comparison, by definition, means you are comparing two different things. There are going to be fundamental differences if you're comparing two different things. But the idea, to my mind, is to try to identify similarities that can illustrate and illuminate one and the other. And in this case, I would say that America has, from its beginnings, has had many wonderful features, but one of them has been, it's been based in white supremacy, first through slavery. And if you go to the African American Museum, you'll learn that it wasn't just the South that was enriched by slavery, but actually the entire country was enriched by slavery and was built upon it by, as it were, by Black bodies, by their expropriation and their exploitation. During slavery, during Jim Crow, during the 20th century, in many ways to this very day. There's generational impact of this sort of thing. If you look at, for example, median wealth of Black families versus white families, it's absolutely astounding, the difference in median wealth, the accumulation of median wealth. So I would say, let's not try to say the Holocaust happened here per se. Certainly, if you think about the genocide of Native Americans, think about the genocide of African Americans, Africans, and later African Americans, we should not walk away from the word genocide. But that doesn't mean that it was the same thing. And we don't have to say it was the same thing to draw a comparison and think about what that means for our own lives. So I resist the urge, if anyone comes to you and says they're the same, or to come to you and say, because they're not the same, there's no point in comparing them. I would resist both of those messages, would be my thinking as an historian.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. To go in a different direction, Cheryl Snyderman is asking, what of the slaughter of Native Americans? When will there be a reckoning in America similar to the German reckoning of their role in the Holocaust? And have any Jewish organizations or individuals stood up for such a reckoning, or have we stood by silently?
Well, I mean, collectively, I don't know. There are certainly prominent Jews who have stood up for that. One of my heroes is Rabbi Aryeh Cohen in California, who has really shown us the way of combining Judaism and Jewish values with values like recognizing past atrocities and addressing them today. Everything from homelessness to systemic racism and beyond. But I don't know the answer to that. I will tell you, there's a reason why Charleston built a memorial to the Holocaust. Before they built a memorial, they're only now, decades later, beginning to build this museum to African-American experience. In Charleston, the harbor of slavery, the hotbed, the symbol of slavery, only now they're beginning to address that with a serious museum. And likewise in America, I remember my professor, George Massa. He was retired, but I learned with him, thank God, in Wisconsin. Very famous professor of the Holocaust of 20th century Germany, comes from a very famous family of pre-Holocaust Germany. The Massa family was a very important publishing family. And he escaped to England, as did much of his family. He eventually came to America and became this professor. And I can remember him still. I was just starting graduate school in the 90s, and I remember him thundering, why has America built a museum to the Holocaust on holy ground? Because if you think about it, the Library Mall is sort of our holy ground. If you think of the nation, if you think of nationalism as a kind of religion of the nation, it's holy ground. Why is there a museum to the Holocaust there and not to the African American experience, or as the question asked, to the Native American experience? And I think the reason is because we didn't do it. We were the good guys in that story. It's not so unblemished. We blocked the refugees from escaping to America, but we didn't commit the Holocaust. And so it's much easier to have that museum than the one that came much later on the African-American experience, or the one that needs to come that I'm not familiar with. There is one on the Library Mall, I'm not familiar with it, on the Native American experience. It's very hard to look at yourself. It's very hard to look at yourself. And by the way, Germany's been very good about it, but that was imposed by the occupying powers. I lived in Austria for a year during my doctoral research. They did not have to go through a forced denazification. And therefore, their reckoning with the Holocaust has been very, very different historically. They have not reckoned with the Holocaust in any systemic way that I know of. There's a reason why, and there's a reason for that. Their self-portrayal as victims of the Nazis rather than participants in the Nazi project has been very hard to uproot. So the context there is also very important. Nobody ever, thankfully, I suppose, occupied America, but in any event, nobody ever forced us to really grapple with this. We have to do it ourselves. And I see that as our goal. And when I try to empower my students to think critically, I try to empower them to think about what they want to address, whether it's memorialization or taking that message forward. So it's a wonderful question, and I hope we address it more and more. Oh, excellent. And link to the museum in Washington, which I have not been to, but I will be going to there very soon as COVID allows me. Thank you.
So we have tons of other questions, but unfortunately, this is going to be the last one. Would it be accurate to call European pogroms state-sponsored, or should the language be more nuanced than that?
It's a great question. Let me begin, because I'm going to forget if I don't. I'm going to type my email into the chat box. I'd like to invite anyone who wants to follow up. Please, by all means, email me and ask your questions, and I'll address them as best I can. This is the most important thing that I can do. So as many more as you can fit, that's fine. And if anyone needs to go, I understand. The answer to your question is, it depends which ones. The late John Clear, who's probably was the greatest scholar of the pogroms in Russian history, went after the Soviet Union fell, went to archive after archive. There was about a decade or so where all the archives of Russia were opened before the Putin regime started closing them again. So he went from archive to archive to archive. He found no evidence whatsoever that the 1880s pogroms were instigated or organized by the Tsarist regime. They were actually surprised by them. They had allowed all that anti-Semitism in the press, so maybe they shouldn't have been surprised, but they were surprised by them. And he said this idea that the Tsarist regime that we get from maybe Fiddler on the Roof was instigating these pogroms or organizing them is absolutely untrue. However, that said, 1905-06, during the First Russian Revolution, absolutely the government was involved. Kristallnacht, the Nazi regime, quite obviously the government was involved. So it just depends on which one. Kristallnacht was absolutely not spontaneous. Historians are quite clear about that. The 1905 pogroms, definitely the Russian government was behind them. They were mob attacks, for sure. And they might have been, by the way, for the Jewish victims, experienced, whether or not the police were given orders to organize it or just joined in when they saw it happening, the Jewish victims, didn't necessarily experience it differently. But we as historians can go back and see that sometimes the government was behind it, and sometimes the government was allowing it. I think the same is true in American history. Sometimes the government was behind it, and sometimes the government was allowing it.
Thank you.
Yeah. And there was one more question apparently that Rachel's going to ask.
Yeah.
Oh, you're muted, Rachel. There we go.
Okay. Yes, there was a question that came up that I think would be wonderful if you could address anonymously. It's an anonymous attendee. How might the United States learn from Germany's full recognition and education about the Holocaust to increase education and recognition of historical violence against African Americans? What
an amazing question. And I think that your anonymous questioner is spot on, because we can learn from Germany. And I'm going to, I'm moving here from history to a certain personal view. I mean, I'm being asked a personal question to a certain extent based on my knowledge of history. So I'll apologize up front if, people might have different views. I think what Germany did, they do a couple things. They have done a couple things right. One thing they've done is reparations. They make reparations. In Judaism, I'm an observant Jew. In Judaism, if you want to do teshuvah, if you want to return to God, return to a good place, to repent, as the English word is, Yom Kippur comes along, you cannot just say, I'm sorry. To God, for sure, but you even cannot just say, I'm sorry to anyone you wronged. If you stole from them, you have to do reparations. Tikkun olam literally means repair. You have to repair the damage that you did. I don't pretend to have the answers what that means exactly in terms of the racial history of the United States, but Germany, I have to tell you as a scholar of modern Israel, the money that Germany gave Israel, it was very controversial. Many Israelis didn't want it. They felt it was wrong. It would somehow expiate the sins, and nothing should expiate the sins. But they needed that money to survive. It was absolutely essential, and they continue to give reparations to this day. I think one lesson we can learn from Germany is the importance of reparations, both to do the right thing and help people, but also as an act of teshuvah, collective teshuvah. I think it's so important. Number two, there are no Adolf Hitler highs. No Jewish or non-Jewish German goes to Hitler High School. No Jewish or non-Jewish German goes to Himmler High School or Heydrich High School. There's no Heydrich Street. These things don't exist. And yet Germans know the history of the Holocaust because they have books and museums, and they study the history, and the artifacts have not all been destroyed. If they need to exist, they exist as museums like the concentration camps, or they're physical museums. But the statues that the Nazis built to glorify that regime have been removed. Streets have been renamed. And I think that America needs to learn from that. We can remember the history of American racism without glorifying the people who instituted it. And I'll cite as an example, by the way, my wife was living in Charlottesville for a year, just a few blocks from Monticello. And Thomas Jefferson's home has been completely redone to teach him in a very nuanced way that is not black and white, no pun intended. It is not one-sided, but actually gets at the problem of somebody who was so important to American identity, but so problematic in his slave ownership and so on. And America needs to do that writ large. They need to understand that understanding history does not mean glorifying it. And third of all, I would say we need to revamp our education system. We're very good now. Many, many states have passed laws that teach the Holocaust, which is wonderful. And it's being taught at the appropriate levels and, by high schools and before high school, and that's all well and good. It's much more important, or at least equally important, that we teach the true history of race in America. And I'm not talking about necessarily the intricacies of, this whole critical race theory and all of that. I don't think, I don't pretend to be an expert. I'm not sure anyone on the call is an expert. I'm just talking about teaching the history of the country in a way that Germany teaches its own history. If you go to a museum in Germany, you typically will not see, of German national history, let's say, 300 years of German history or some such thing, 500 years, whatever it is. As you go through the exhibit, you'll typically not see the Holocaust in some separate wing. It'll typically be part of the walk you take. Perhaps it'll be dimmed, lighter, less lighting, something that gives that somber tone, but it's part of the story. So Germans have to understand what makes them German and proud of their identity and proud of of who they are, has to grapple with that history. And they understand that these things it's not an either or. They don't have to forget to be able to exist as proud of who they are. And I think America needs to do something similar. So I think the question is brilliant. I think it's spot on. And I think we can learn a lot from them about how to grapple with the very difficult past of the essence of who we are without thinking about, oh my God, what did your grandparent do? What did your grandparent do? It's not about that. It's about the country as a whole and how we can teach the history and glorify the values that we want to glorify and put in museums the values that belong in museums.
Thank you. Glad we got that one in.
I'm so glad you got that one in. What a terrific question.
All right, thank you. Yes, thank you, Dr. Shanes. Just some closing comments. Confronting the past and understanding its relevance for today can be challenging for both nations and individuals. But as we know, the more we can learn from our past, the stronger we can become in addressing the shameful parts of human history. So tonight, we've had an incredible opportunity to learn about and to commemorate two pogroms, Kristallnacht in Germany and Tulsa in America. As Jews and as Americans, we recognize and honor the shared experiences we have had with the Black community that draw us together and inspire us to carry on our stories and their lessons. So to refer to your words again, Dr. Shanes, may all of us together say never again to such violence against humanity.
Amen.
We want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. We extend our deepest appreciation to you, Dr. Joshua Shanes, for calling in from South Carolina to be a part of our program. Please feel free to contact Emily Goodman for additional learning materials on Kristallnacht or the Tulsa Race Massacre. We will put and have put her email address into the chat should you want to reach out. We look forward to seeing all of you on May 1st for our 2022 Yom HaShoah commemoration. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Be well, be safe.
Thank you.